If you want your candidate to win, don't vote for them on Election Day. What people don't realize is that Election Day is a myth. It's a fairy tale. It doesn't exist. And the biggest mistake that you as a voter can make is to... In the next few minutes, I'm going to show you the exact winning strategy to put your candidate in office, to put your party in a position of power, and to save this country. And I'm going to do all that with M&Ms. This is the most important election in our country's history. How many times have we heard somebody say that exact phrase? It seems like every couple of years we get the same message. This is it. This election will decide which direction our country goes in. We need to make sure we're making the right choices to save our democracy. Well, if that's true, and if you really want to save the country, and if you really want your candidate to win, then you've got to understand exactly what happens in an election and why the worst thing you can do is vote on Election Day. Traditionally on Election Day, people go out and they cast a vote for the person that they want to lead them for the next several years. It's kind of like taking an M&M and tossing it into a jar. The candidate who has the most M&Ms in their jar wins, but that's not how it works anymore. Election Day is a myth. Thanks to the pandemic and power-hungry state judges and legislatures, not to mention special interest groups and more lawyers than you could ever imagine, Election Day no longer exists. It's been replaced by election week or election weeks, or even in some cases, election month. Some people rebuke early voting and some people embrace it. In fact, one party or one bag of M&Ms has embraced early voting much more than the other. And that bag of M&Ms is the blue one. Blue voters will rush to the polls almost immediately. As soon as the polls open, they start throwing their M&Ms in the jar. And by the time Election Day rolls around, they've already amassed a pretty hefty lead. The red M&Ms behave very differently. Red M&Ms prefer to honor the long-standing tradition of voting on Election Day, and only on Election Day. Sure, there are a few that cast their votes early or mail in their ballots, but not many. The majority of red M&Ms wait until Election Day to head to the polls. They see a certain nostalgia in it or patriotism, but as a result, they begin Election Day with substantially fewer votes in the jar than their blue M&M counterparts. That means that in just one single day, the red M&Ms have to overcome the deficit created by the blue M&Ms who've been voting already for several weeks. I mean, you can clearly get way more M&Ms in your jar over several weeks than you can in one day, and that puts the red M&Ms at a clear disadvantage, a self-imposed, dangerous, and totally unnecessary disadvantage. And don't get me wrong, on Election Day, they come out in great big numbers to throw their red M&Ms in the jar for their chosen candidate. But at the same time, there are also some blue M&Ms who are deciding to wait till Election Day, and they're coming out and they're throwing their M&Ms into the jar for their respective candidate. So even though the red M&Ms are starting to see their levels rise, they are still always constantly chasing the blue M&Ms. And sometimes it's almost impossible to catch up. But that's not even the biggest problem with waiting till Election Day to throw your M&M in the jar. There's so much more. Let's say a blue voter wants to toss their M&M into a jar before Election Day. So they go to their polling place, but there was a water main break and the polling place is closed. No problem. Since there's several days until the election, this blue voter can just come back the next day and toss their M&M into the jar. Or they could come back the next 2 days, or even next week. They have ample opportunities to make good on the vote they weren't able to cast because of that pesky water main break. Now on the flip side, let's say a red voter wants to toss their M&M into the jar for their candidate on Election Day, but that pesky water main break has shut down the location and it's closed. They can't come back tomorrow. There is no tomorrow. They waited till the very last minute to cast their ballot. And it's not just water main breaks. Maybe it was vandalized, or there was a power outage, or the voting machines were hacked. There are all kinds of emergencies that can pop up and make it more difficult for you to vote. If you only give yourself 1 day to vote, you're limiting your opportunity to get that M&M into the jar. So now they send this red M&M across town to fill out a provisional ballot at some other precinct. But maybe this red M&M can't make it there because they only have 30 minutes before they have to get back to work or lose their job. And the line at the precinct across town is longer than the line at the ladies' room at a Taylor Swift concert. But the blue M&Ms who go early show up at their polling place and there's no lines, there's nobody there, it's empty. It looks like the men's room at a Taylor Swift concert. So they cast their vote and they go on their merry way. All you have to do is go back and take a look at the last few election cycles, and you'll see that there's always some kind of emergency or unforeseen circumstance that shuts down polling locations and keeps those red M&Ms from tossing their vote into the jar. I'm not saying they happen on purpose. I'm not saying they don't happen on purpose, but I am saying there's a fail-safe method. Don't vote on election day. Yes, it would be fantastic if this country could go back to the tradition of one day to vote. One day when we all go out and we fill out a paper ballot and we count them all and we find out who is going to be in our leadership positions for the next 2, 4, or 6 years. That would be fantastic, but that's not the reality we live in right now. And the best way to lose an election is to ignore reality and instead live in a fantasy world that does not exist. Whichever M&M embraces the idea of early voting is going to put themselves in a much more beneficial place to win this election. Or any election. And that is why, if you want your candidate to win and your party to be victorious, and if you want to save the country, don't vote on election day.